in Kafka's early days, nobody cared because it was all done inside the data center, so you didn't pay for the network charges, but you didn't do with the cloud. There were, I think, 155 contributors to AK 4.2, which is a lot.
Yes.
So if you imagine trying to convince a company to have 155 engineers in an engineering team, you just can't do it, right? So it's really good you've got this kind of collaboration.
Welcome to the Confluent Developer Podcast. I am your host, Tim Berglund. Today, we had a good old-fashioned open-source Apache Kafka episode. I got to speak with Andrew Schofield, who is a principal engineer at Confluent and a committer and PMC member on the Kafka project. He's been a key figure in the Kafka space for like a decade at least, and he's really got a passion for the community. We talked about queues for Kafka. If you don't know that feature, check out the show notes for a link to a great explanation, as well as diskless Kafka and more. Kafka really is a vibrant project, and people like Andrew are a big reason why. So let's listen in. Hey, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tim. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to have you on. I figured, a guy like you, it would be good to talk about what's going on in the world of Apache Kafka. There are a lot of really interesting things in flight right now. You got your hand in some of them, and some of them are just things happening in the community. What I feel like having Andrew Schofield on the podcast and not talking about queues would be weird. So, do you want to start with queues?
Sure. Let's talk about queues. So, I've been working on queues for a long time. So, I started working on queuing systems in 1991 because I'm that old. So
I'm with you. Not that I was working on queuing systems then, but maybe there was probably a real-time operating system that had a queue in between tasks that around that age, that year I was maybe working with. But yeah, queuing systems pre-Kafka.
Yeah, that's right. So I know my stuff when it comes to queues, and I started working on Kafka in 2015, I think. But not hands-on on the code at that point, right? More kind of
as a user,
leading a team, productizing it, that sort of thing, right? And then over time, I thought, no, I actually want to get my hands on the code and start changing it.
Yeah.
And I observed when I first started working with customers on Kafka that they struggled with trying to use it like a queue, right? They would be porting queuing applications over to Kafka, and they would go, well, it's really difficult. And the initial discussion you have with them is, well, don't use it like a queue then. And that works to an extent. But then sometimes people, they just say, well, no, I've got a kind of queuing shape of problem. And so I saw that a very long time ago, but I wasn't sure I wanted to solve it in Kafka to start with.
Right. And I've certainly taken that question on a number of occasions. How do you make it act like a queue? And do you think it was because they actually had queuing use cases, or it was just habituation? Queues are all they've had for a career, and they're porting things, and they just can't free their minds. I'm like, what? I mean, obviously, we're building queues for you're building queues for Kafka now, so there's something there.
Yeah.
But, what do you think about that?
I think it's a mixture. I think so. Quite often, yes, they were just used to it, right? So they just tried to port something verbatim, and then they ended up having thousands of partitions for no good reason and that kind of thing. So they kind of got themselves into a mess. And sometimes they just needed to, kind of rethink how they did things, because it was quite common in the, in 2015, 2017 kind of era that somebody would come in with an architecture hat on and saying, you're going to use Kafka, and everyone would salute and rush off after it, right?
Right.
So they didn't really have the skills yet, right? And that's not true these days because, there's lots of Kafka skills around. But I think people just try to replicate what they've previously done, not necessarily for a good reason.
Sure, but just because it was...
And you have to, maybe think quite deeply if you want to change to, from a message queuing model to an event streaming one, and not everything kind of translates across, easily, I think.
And could I ask you to dig into that? I'm sorry, you're trying to get warmed up on queues for Kafka, and I'm like, well, let me ask you this. Fundamentally, what's the insight? I think a lot of people listening to this have an intuition about what a queue is and what a log is and the difference. But if pressed, I don't know if everybody could give a really crisp answer. So what's a queue, and what's the difference between Kafka and a queue on the most fundamental level you can describe?
Yeah. So I think it's say between Kafka and an event stream, probably, right? So an event stream, you really are getting an unbounded sequence of events. They're in order, right? You may well depend upon the order, and you intend to consume all of them. All of the ones that you're given. And I know that your consumer group divides your topic up and gives separate partitions to the different members of the group, but the subset of the topic you're being given, you're going to get all of them, and you have to be able to keep up. You have to process them all yourself. Okay, you can't easily share them, and if you want to, have more consumers, you need more partitions. That's just the way that Kafka works. It slices everything up and then gives you the whole partition. Whereas message queue is typically much more individual items, right? You're processing them one at a time, right? And there aren't necessarily links between them. Now, that isn't true in all cases, but quite often it's something like a command, go and do this, right? And you don't necessarily need to know what the previous three were. You just kind of process it by itself. And if you've got a really kind of granular workload like that, being given the consumer group semantics is kind of inconvenient. You don't really want it like that because you have to, with the consumer group, you commit your offset, essentially your current position that you're going to be consuming from, and you have to do it for every single record if you're going to do it, in a kind of a queuing way, and it wasn't really designed for that. So, it's all about the kind of the granularity of the model that you have in mind, I think.
Okay. The and consumer groups being very much baked into Kafka traditionally, they did get in the way, right, of queue behavior.
They did.
Yeah. They
did. If somebody really wanted a queue, then it was kind of a bit of a nuisance. So then I thought, well, okay, well, what's the best way to represent this? Because I kicked it around for quite a long time before we ended up with the KIP in the community, and that was, I think the KIP was published nearly 3 years ago now, something like that. So it was just before a Kafka Summit London, I think in something like May 3 years ago. I think that was about right. And we tried various things and tried different kind of APIs like JMS and that sort of thing. So I did quite a few experiments with it, and then eventually thought, well, actually, maybe what you want to do is just make it a new kind of consumer in Kafka. That would be it, because people were building things, including me, were building things on top of Kafka to make it behave like a queue. And they just kind of, you had an impedance mismatch there, and we were kind of, solving it in code on top of Kafka. But then you have to work out, what's the life cycle of it, who manages it, and all this kind of stuff. So it kind of gets complicated doing like that. And then I thought, well, all right, well, what if we were actually to put it in Kafka as a new kind of group? What would it actually need to do? And, one of the big decisions was, don't invent a queue in Kafka, right? With share groups, you're still on topics, your data is on topics, you're just consuming the topic in a different way, because we could have made a thing called a queue. But, nearly everything works with topics these days. If you think about the way schemas are configured, the way Kafka Connect works, all of this stuff, it's all topic-based. So it really needs to be using topics.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so, if you want to teach AIs about a new thing, there's a big runway there, right? Like everybody knows topics. It's fine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then it was, all right, well, if we're not actually going to create queues, what's kind of the essence of a queue? What do you actually need to make it behave like one, even though you haven't got a queue? So, you need an API which has kind of record at a time behavior. You don't need to, you don't need to make it laborious. You can still do things in batches if you want to, but you need that, and you need to be able to kind of give a disposition, an opinion on every record that you're given, right? Did I process it? Did I not process it? Is it a bad one? That kind of thing. And all the different systems, they do this stuff in different ways, but they've fundamentally got the same kind of idea, which is essentially a kind of a state machine per record or per message. And the system is, coordinating all of these and giving you the behavior of a queue. So that's kind of what we did.
Over your history of queuing systems, our concept of scale, the popular conception of scale has changed quite a bit from 1991 to the present day. And there were, to be doing things at sort of global scale in 1991, you had to be like a utility, a bank, a government, something like that, airline maybe. And now post-internet, post-mobile devices, it's more commonplace. Not all of us build huge systems like that. But is there a difference in the scaling characteristics? So all that to say, it's a little bit unfair to ask if the legacy message queues could scale like Kafka, because I don't know if they were built to, but Is there something fundamental about the way they were built that just made them expect to be a little slower because of the message at a time acknowledgement? I mean, is there anything in there that has been a challenge scale-wise in building queues into Kafka?
I think that they have a pretty different model typically, right? In terms of the way they handle storage. So they don't really expect to have a lot of backlog. Whereas in a Kafka system, one of the things about it is it's effectively unlimited, right? You don't care.
Right.
So they're quite different in terms of that. And another thing, I think probably the area where queues for Kafka is kind of, least comparable to some of the other messaging systems at the moment is in the area of transactions. Right, because we can process data that was written using transactions, but you can't acknowledge it using a transaction at this point. There's a kit for that, but it's not done yet, and it's much more difficult to do that when you have your state distributed across multiple logs.
Well, yes.
Whereas in a traditional message queuing system, you've got one log per server, right? And everything goes in there. So you can do coordination of all of your operations across your queues or whatever, and then just commit once and then it happens, right? But then you've got all of the data going through a single log. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts. And then what you tend to find is that the message queuing systems come up with some kind of clustering. Okay, so they have maybe some kind of directory which says the queue of this name is actually hosted by multiple servers, but they're kind of still independent things, and each one of the servers still has its own singular log. So, you can slice it and dice it in several ways, I suppose, would be the thing. Yeah.
Now, a quick word from our sponsor. Confluent Developer, the podcast, is brought to you by Confluent Developer, the website, which has everything you need as a developer of data streaming systems. And it's completely free. We've got curriculum, hands-on exercises, executable tutorials, the online data streaming engineer certification, also free, a way to find a meetup near you, those are free. Everything is there. I really want you to be successful in your journey as a data streaming engineer, and this is the site that has what you need. Check it out at developer.confluent.io. That's developer.confluent.io. Now back to the show. They're all single leader systems clustered like you might shard Postgres or Mongo or something like that.
Something like that, and you're finding that that they sometimes they're taking other consensus out, protocols, algorithms from the world of software engineering, like Craft and that kind of thing, and building something a bit more Kafka-ish, but still for a single server, just so that because the high availability, the availability characteristics of these things were, they kind of looked a bit 1991, right, really, where you get a crash of the server, you start it up again on some storage, which you copied, and then, whereas there wasn't really any, there wasn't any consensus, whereas there are a few of the systems which are now picking up that as well. So they look like, little islands of consensus, I suppose, but you've still got individual queues on each of these servers. So Kafka is a bit more kind of distributed than that, right?
Yes.
You can have a big cluster that has all of these availability characteristics for each of the partitions within it, right? Without having to manage them all kind of independently and have, lots of separate quora and that kind of thing.
Right. And so where are we right now? We're recording this in the middle of March. Is it the Ides? No, that's tomorrow. Middle of March, 2026. And what's current state of queues for Kafka? What's shipped? What hasn't? Bring us up to date.
Yeah, so we did it as a 3-stage delivery. So there was an early access in 4.0, and then a preview in 4.1, and then general availability in 4.2. So Apache Kafka 4.2 has GA of queues.
Only just a little bit ago,
and
too. So right? Oh, it's fairly recent.
Yeah, absolutely, very recent. And then 4.3, which is coming along pretty soon. So the code freeze for 4.3 is only 2 days away.
Oh, goodness. So
we just got a little feature in that to give you a bit more kind of configuration options. But the next big thing is dead letter queues. That's 4.4, I expect. So engineering of that has started. We have an improved kit. So we're working on that, but landing it in 4.3 wasn't going to happen. So that was kind of the biggest thing that people said when we talked to them about it was, okay, well, what do we do if something doesn't work? In the original queues for Kafka KIP, it basically said we will perform a limited number of retries and then it comes off the queue because it will get in your way. Because that's always been one of the problems with Kafka. You get a poison message. How do you jump over it?
This is from the consume side that I am reaching some computational failure processing the thing.
That's right. So a well-written application can handle a badly formed message. It can, exception handling, and it can, but if you don't, then it's in your way, right? So we took the decision with queues for Kafka that wouldn't be the case, and the message comes out of your way. But then there's, well, what do I do with it? How do I find it? You've potentially lost something which you should have caught. So dead letter queues give you another topic, and if you get a message which is not passed, it's not delivered successfully, it gets copied onto the dead letter queue topic, and you can do use it like a black box recorder or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the next thing, and that'll so 4.4 towards the end of this year, but still this year. So I think that'll be the most kind of requested thing that we didn't have in the original delivery. So that's good.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Do you see much? I mean, in the past, you said you worked early on in Kafka with people wanting queuing behavior, either because they really needed it or because they just couldn't break free of old habits, whatever that is. Do you have much touch these days with like what folks are doing, use cases, and things going on in the wild? I realized as an engineer and PMC member and everything, sometimes you're not hands-on with those folks, but
yeah, I think the honest answer is not as much as I used to. I think different people working in the community have kind of different things they work on. So I tend to be quite community focused these days, right? So I do a lot of kind of KIP reviews, KIP writing, looking at other people's PRs, all this kind of stuff, right? But it's more technology focused and less kind of customer focused. But I work with people who do more of that. But I used to get more customer visibility in my previous job anyway, because I spent a lot of time talking to customers directly. I would get flown over to places and have to give a presentation on Kafka, and I get asked all difficult questions, but I don't get that directly these days,
right.
I suppose.
I know that life. Speaking of you being community focused, which you are, and it is absolutely wonderful. You do a lot of great work. What else is going on apart from queues? What are some other things that are happening in Kafka? I mean, I think it seems like it's as vibrant a project as ever, and I love that. So what do you see?
Yeah, I think it is very vibrant, and I think there are lots of vendors who are contributing significant things these days, which is good to see, right? So there were, I think, 155 contributors to AK 4.2, which is a lot.
Yes.
So if you imagine trying to convince a company to have 155 engineers in an engineering team, you just can't do it, right? So it's really good you've got this kind of collaboration. And there are some significant KIPs, or one of them is more than just one KIP. So one of the significant things is a project called Diskless, which is being led by a company called Ivan. And the principle behind that is running Kafka on cloud storage is expensive because you replicate data between the brokers and you pay for the network charges between the brokers. So you don't want to do it like that, right? In Kafka's early days, nobody cared because it was all done inside a data center. So you didn't pay for the network charges, but you didn't do with the cloud. So the idea is essentially we can get rid of that by using cloud storage rather than local disks in the cloud. And then you don't need to replicate it in the same way, right? You'll just find that it's effectively free. Now, that's a pretty significant thing to put into Kafka. And it's going to be a family of KIPs, right? And the first one, 1150 has been voted through. So that was kind of a foundational one. So, you probably remember when Craft was done, there was KIP 500, and it was basically, we're going to put Craft in. Great, isn't it? And then it didn't say anything much more than that, right? And then there were,
all these follow-on KIPs. I was doing podcasts about that for years, like a season of my life.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's not that it took. It was just I mean, if I don't like that, I should go make my own consensus protocol. It's hard to do. It takes a long time.
It is. So 1150 is voted, right? And that was really good, right? Because So when you write a KIP, you need to get at least 3 committers to vote for it, and that's basically go ahead, you can start work on it, right?
Gotcha.
Whereas there were 9 voters on Discless, which is a lot. So it was a broad spread across lots of
vociferous support.
That's right. Yeah. So the community basically said, we want this, right? Now you get down to the nitty gritty, right? Because now there are real KIPs behind it, and they are significant in their own right. They are still under active discussion. I think they've probably got a fair way to go. But when, giving them this level of scrutiny is good, because it means that when they land, this community of people kind of collaborating in the open, they can still achieve great things, right? But it means that you need to give things scrutiny early on in order to make sure that things are going to be sensible. It's more difficult to manage things like this than it is inside a company. So, there are 2 fairly significant KIPs which are under investigation or under discussion. I think they've probably got a fair way to go yet, but they're in pretty good shape in terms of you can kind of read and understand what they mean. Whereas with some big KIPs, it takes a while before anyone outside the author can actually really understand them. But they're getting there, and until we get some of those voted through, then the code won't actually start entering Kafka. We need approval that this technical change can be made, and then they'll start getting merged. But they're still under discussion, those ones.
It's funny as an outsider, not a committer, I find that most KIPs, if I'm just reading the description, I'm not really trying to follow the detail of the design, but if I'm just reading the description and trying to understand, okay, what is this doing to the system? What are the implications for, the surface area on the outside of the product, architecturally, what would be implications and how you'd use Kafka and all that. I have to say, most KIPs at that level, right, I find to be pretty friendly. Sometimes there'll be a link to a longer doc that you have to go read or something like that. I imagine as an insider, you're like, yeah, no, Tim, they're not that good. And all the other committers are probably agreeing with you and each other, but I find them to be well written. I just want to say that because I do have to go through those on a semi-regular basis, make sure I understand what's going on.
Yeah, I think they typically are. When you're reviewing them as a kind of somebody who will vote on them,
right,
then you basically you're looking for holes, right? Uh-huh. What didn't you say? So they are typically well written, and you can kind of understand them relatively quickly. But what kind of things did you miss? So an example with the Discless stuff, and I need to go and reread those ones now because I read them a while back and put some comments in, but I need to go deeply into it again. One of the problems was how do you garbage collect the cloud storage reliably? Because what you do in Discless is you effectively you wait for a little bit, you chunk up a load of data, and then you put it into object storage, and then you've got a handle to this object storage thing, and this is basically a pointer. They call it batch coordinates off to the records. But you could crash halfway through this, so you've then orphaned something. How do you find it? That sort of thing. So there are plenty of things in there because I imagine that when this lands, it'll be a multi-release thing again. Maybe 3 releases like with use of Kafka, I expect.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe they don't entirely solve the garbage collection to start with, but before GA it has to be. And last time I looked, there wasn't really, there was discussion about it, but not a solution yet. So this, that's how you kind of review them when you're going to vote on them anyway. Is what could go wrong, what hasn't been thought about, and I'll talk about another one in a minute because there's another kind of wrinkle in that one as well. So another significant one, which is actually this one has moved really fast. So there's one called cluster mirroring. So this is for disaster recovery. It's for linking clusters together and replicating data asynchronously between them in case you get a volcano go off under your data center or whatever, right? So it's a useful thing.
Version 3. I mean, this is a thing that has been done.
I think calling it Mirror Maker 3 is probably rude. I don't think they like that.
It occurred to me when I said that we don't want to call it Mirror Maker 3. That's not very nice.
No.
But my point being, it is the third at bat here to solve this problem. And tell us why it's the good one.
Yeah, so this is the good one because it's built into the brokers. Okay, it isn't Kafka Connect, right? It's not Kafka Connect. It's basically a pump, and running actually inside the broker. And you configure it using, a mirror command. There are mirror RPCs in the protocol, all this kind of stuff. So it becomes a mirror is a proper object now, rather than just a kind of a thing running on the side. And this is again an interesting one, right? It's I don't know, not exactly a collaboration between multiple vendors. So there are 6 authors on the kip, which is unusual, but it's a really nicely written kip, right? It's not totally finished again yet, but it's certainly, it's definitely ready for proper scrutiny, right? So, the stage of review of this kip, I think, is pretty mature, right? You can believe that if they implemented it as it said, that it would basically work with, a few mistakes while we're sorting out the review comments, but it's basically there. And it's only been a month since it was published, right? So this one has moved really fast.
All right.
And I imagine that this will do another kind of multi-release thing, but you could, if they manage to get the discussion finished relatively quickly, you could imagine the first bits appear in 4.4, right? So it's moving pretty quickly, that one.
Okay, very nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, usually with big multi-release or even multi-kips like that, because that's a significant feature, very complex. Like the first release, you might get either it'll work. You can use it locally to debug, or here are some APIs we put in place and started to deprecate some other APIs because, laying the groundwork. But then you get a few releases later and you have the fully baked feature.
Yeah. So that one's got, some interesting stuff as well, right? Because it's effectively puts the configuration for talking to another cluster in this cluster, right? Which we haven't kind of done before. Oh. So, I imagine that there'll have to be, maybe a follow-on kit for how to make sure that's done securely and that sort of thing. Kafka Connect has always had this sort of thing in config providers, and maybe we need something similar when mirroring is, finally finished. But when we did queues for Kafka, there was one big kip, 932, and so we delivered that in 4.0, 4.1, 4.2, but 4.2 had another, I think, 4 or 5 kips. So things where maybe they would have got a 932, but we realized the error of our ways. We kind of put some, addenda in there, essentially. I can well imagine that you do that custom mirroring as well, and just to, close a few things off.
Absolutely.
But it's quite an effective way of doing it.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And I mean, I think we all know it's very difficult to know what it is you are actually going to build. Even when you know the direction you're headed, you learn along the way that there are things that you were just wrong about or ignorant of and didn't imagine. And, those are the follow-ons. That's what it's like to build things.
It is. It certainly is. It certainly is. Yeah, because the latest kit we put in for queues for Kafka was to do with configurations, and it was just we've got them. We made some or left some gaps in 932. We need to fill them in now, and it was quite cheap, but yeah, it had to be done. So.
There you go.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a lot. Is there anything else that's big or even small on the?
So I think those are the big ones. I suppose there's another one. There's one to do with multi-tenancy as well, but that one I don't know. It's hard to kind of tell what's going on there. In that it was there's quite a large document. I don't really feel that the discussion is moving forward at the moment, right?
Okay.
So my honest opinion is we will end up with multi-tenancy in Apache Kafka, right? I don't really feel the kip which is out there at the moment will be it.
Gotcha.
But we will see, because it might migrate into it. But what people are doing is they are, so the Kafka community is, some people who use it and some people who sell it, essentially, right? It's that combination. Because quite a few big companies use open source Apache Kafka internally,
yes,
right? And they want to make it better in order to make their lives easier.
Yes.
So this is a good kind of contributor. And then there are others who they have a business selling Kafka and they want to make it better in order to have something better to sell. Sure. But at the end of the day, they're still trying to do the same thing.
I mean, I work for a company like that.
Provide something general purpose and useful. So. Pardon? You
and I work for a company like that. So
we do, absolutely, and it's perfectly fine because everyone knows it, right? But at the end of the day, you're trying to make something, something more useful, something better. Yes. And so my point of view on this is essentially we're trying to make Kafka more general purpose, right? We don't want to, if you have to think you've got a problem to solve and you have to go, well, can I solve it with Kafka, or is it, that doesn't quite fit here? Maybe, I don't know, large messages or something like that, right? There are some things it doesn't quite support yet, which if it did, then you would then go, well, no, actually we can do more stuff now. And building in DR is like that, right? Providing support for cloud storage is like that. Multi-tenancy is like that, because you see people who've got one shared Kafka cluster, and they kind of use name prefixing in order to make sure that different people get to access different topics. But if you could actually say everyone thinks they have a cluster, and they can't see the kind of divisions between it, but everyone can have a topic called T1, but they're actually all on the same piece of physical hardware, that kind of would be good. And so I think multi-tenancy will land one day. I don't think I see the kip yet, but we will see.
We will see.
Yeah.
My guest today has been Andrew Schofield. Andrew, thanks for being a part of the Confluent Developer podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. Bye.